In a quiet village in East Anglia, a farmer turns soil that has been worked for 15 centuries, speaking a language whose roots were carried across the North Sea in oar-drawn boats. His DNA traces back to warriors who arrived as mercenaries and stayed as kings. He is, by every meaningful measure, English, and he represents one of the strangest genetic paradoxes in European history. The Anglo-Saxons didn't replace the Britons. They didn't vanish into the Normans. They became something entirely new, and that something still walks England today. So who were these people, really? And what does modern DNA reveal about a transformation we thought we understood? Today we're decoding what ancient genomes, abandoned settlements, and centuries of buried evidence reveal about the most misunderstood migration in English history. If you're fascinated by how DNA is rewriting ancient origins, hit subscribe. We're decoding lost peoples every week. The Anglo-Saxon arrival is the most misunderstood transformation in English history. For over 1,000 years, popular imagination has painted the Anglo-Saxons as foreign conquerors who swept across the island, slaughtering or driving out the native Britons, replacing one people with another, only to be deluded themselves centuries later by Normans, Danes, and the slow churn of European migration. The truth is stranger and more unsettling. The Anglo-Saxons did not replace the Britons. The Britons did not vanish. And the Anglo-Saxons, despite being conquered themselves in 1066, never actually left. Modern genetic studies have begun to unravel a story that contradicts nearly every assumption baked into school textbooks. Recent ancient DNA analysis of skeletal remains from across Anglo-Saxon era England has revealed that today's English population, particularly in eastern counties, carries substantial Anglo-Saxon ancestry alongside significant continuity with the pre-existing Briton population. The genetic fingerprint of the Anglo-Saxons is strongest in regions like East Anglia, the East Midlands, and parts of the southeast, where modern populations can carry between 30 and 40% ancestry traceable to the migrants who arrived after Rome's collapse. But Briton DNA persists alongside it. Celtic genetic markers, particularly in the west and north, never disappeared. What emerged from this period was not replacement, but fusion. This creates a paradox that has puzzled historians, linguists, and now geneticists for decades. If the Anglo-Saxons did not replace the Britons, why did the Celtic language vanish so completely from the regions they dominated? In Sussex, in Essex, across most of what became the English heartland, Celtic place names are virtually non-existent. The names of rivers, hills, towns, and farms are overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon in origin. Modern English itself contains almost no Celtic vocabulary, despite 1,000 years of supposed coexistence. The linguistic record looks like total replacement. The genetic record looks like blending. Both cannot be entirely true. When a foreign population arrives in a new land, historians typically expect to see one of a few patterns. Conquest with replacement, where invaders kill or displace the original inhabitants and impose their bloodline. Disease, where pathogens devastate the indigenous population and erase cultural continuity. Assimilation, where the newcomers are absorbed into the larger native population, leaving genetic traces but cultural fingerprints that fade. Or coexistence, where two peoples live side by side, gradually merging over centuries. The Anglo-Saxon transformation fits none of these patterns cleanly. There was no continent-wide plague at the moment of arrival. The numbers of incoming Germanic settlers, while significant, were almost certainly too small to physically replace the existing British population through sheer demographic weight. There is no evidence of systematic extermination on a scale that could account for the linguistic erasure. And yet the cultural transformation was so total that within a few centuries an entire island had reorganized itself around the language, laws, and identity of a people who had begun as a handful of mercenaries on a Kentish beach. So, what actually happened? How does a relatively small migration of warriors, farmers, and families transform the language, the place names, the legal traditions, the agricultural practices, and the political identity of an entire island, while leaving the genetic signature of the indigenous population largely intact. How does a people supposedly conquered by Normans in 1066 still form the genetic and cultural backbone of modern England 1,000 years later? This is the question that has driven generations of archaeologists, linguists, and now geneticists to investigate the Anglo-Saxon arrival from every conceivable angle. And what they have uncovered is something far more interesting than any simple invasion narrative. The Anglo-Saxons did not conquer England in the way the Romans did. They did not vanish in the way the Romans did either. They did something stranger. They became the foundation of a new identity that absorbed everything around it. The Britons did not disappear. They were folded into a new society. The Anglo-Saxon elite did not stay foreign forever. They became English. And when the Vikings arrived, when the Normans arrived, those waves too were absorbed into a cultural and genetic continuum that had, by then, already fused into something that could survive almost anything. The empty earthworks, the abandoned settlements, the Sutton Hoo treasures buried beneath Suffolk soil are not the tombstones of a vanished people. They are monuments to the people who became modern England. To understand how that transformation actually happened, we have to start with the moment the lights went out across an entire province, and a power vacuum opened that would change the island forever. When Rome withdrew its legions from Britain in the early 5th century, it did not simply remove an occupying army. It removed the entire scaffolding of a society that had been built on Roman administration for nearly 400 years. Roads that had been maintained for generations began to crack. Towns that had relied on Roman trade networks contracted. Coinage stopped circulating. Tax collection collapsed. The Romano-British aristocracy that had inherited the trappings of Roman civilization, the villas, the Latin literacy, the centralized bureaucracy, suddenly found itself without the imperial machinery that had made any of it possible. They had inherited a Roman lifestyle without the Roman Empire underneath it. And the result was a slow-motion unraveling that left the island vulnerable in ways that would prove catastrophic. The Romano-British leaders tried to hold the system together. They organized themselves into successor kingdoms, fragmented territories ruled by warlords who claimed the legitimacy of Rome without possessing its strength. They could not muster the disciplined infantry, the engineering corps, the supply networks, or the strategic depth that had once allowed the empire to crush threats on multiple frontiers simultaneously. They were aristocrats without an army, rulers without a state, and they were surrounded by enemies who could smell the weakness from across the sea. This pattern was not new. Britain had been transformed by waves of incoming peoples for thousands of years before Rome ever arrived. The Doggerland migrants, the ancestors of Britain's earliest inhabitants, had crossed land bridges that have since vanished beneath the North Sea. The Celts had arrived later, bringing the languages and cultures that defined pre-Roman Britain. The Romans had come and reshaped the southern half of the island into a province of the empire. Each wave had transformed the land and its people, layering new identities over old ones, sometimes through conquest, sometimes through gradual settlement and absorption. The departure of Rome simply opened the door for the next wave. And the first whispers of that wave had already been arriving, decades before the final collapse. The Saxons had been raiding the eastern coast of Britain throughout the late Roman period. They came in small bands, in shallow boats, striking coastal settlements and disappearing back across the North Sea before any organized response could be mounted. Roman authorities had built a series of coastal fortifications known as the Saxon shore forts, specifically to defend against these raids. The threat was familiar. What was not familiar was what came next. As the post-Roman British kingdoms struggled to defend themselves from threats on multiple fronts, raiders from the Picts to the north, from the Scots in Ireland to the west, and continued Saxon raids on the eastern coast, they made a decision that would change the island forever. They invited the very people who had been raiding their coasts to come and defend them. The most famous of these decisions came from a king named Vortigern. ruler of a kingdom in the southeast, sometime in the 450s. Vortigern was facing pressure from Picts and Scots pushing into his territory. He needed warriors. He needed men who knew how to fight, who could be deployed quickly, and who would not demand the political concessions that hiring rival British kings would require. So he turned to the Saxons. He invited a band of mercenaries led by two brothers, Hengest and Horsa, to defend his kingdom. He gave them land. He gave them payment. He gave them legitimacy as protectors of the realm. And for a time, the arrangement worked. The Saxon mercenaries fought against the Picts and Scots. They demonstrated their value. They became indispensable. Then they realized something that has been the fatal lesson for every empire that has ever hired barbarian mercenaries to do its fighting. The mercenaries were stronger than the kingdom they were defending. Around 455, Hengest and Horsa rebelled against Vortigern. They turned their swords on the king who had invited them, defeated his forces, and established the first independent Saxon kingdom on British soil at Kent. The mercenaries had become rulers, the defenders had become conquerors, and the floodgates that Vortigern had cracked open with a single political decision now stood wide. Behind Hengest and Horsa, across the North Sea, entire communities were watching. They saw what had happened. They saw that the post-Roman British kingdoms could not effectively resist a determined Germanic warband. They saw fertile land, weakened defenses, and opportunity. The trickle of mercenaries was about to become a flood of settlers, and the people who would arrive over the next 2 centuries would not come as raiders or hired blades. They would come with their families, their livestock, their gods, and every intention of staying. The migration that followed Vortigern's catastrophic miscalculation was not a single invasion. It was a sustained, generations-long movement of Germanic peoples across the North Sea, drawn from 3 distinct homelands and arriving in waves that would continue for nearly 2 centuries. The Saxons came from the lands around the Elbe River in what is now northern Germany. The Angles came from the Anglan region of what is now Denmark, a people whose name would eventually be applied to the entire island they helped reshape. The Jutes came from the Jutland Peninsula, further north along the Danish coast. Smaller groups followed too. The Frisians, from the coastal lowlands of what is now the Netherlands, contributed their own settlers and their own linguistic influences. But the 3 primary peoples, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, made up the bulk of the migration that would transform Britain into England. The geographic patterns of their settlement were not random. The Angles tended to push farther north, eventually establishing kingdoms in what would become East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. The Saxons concentrated in the south, founding the kingdoms of Wessex, Sussex, and Essex, names that still carry the imprint of their origin: West Saxons, South Saxons, East Saxons. The Jutes settled in Kent, in Hampshire, and on the Isle of Wight, a smaller migration but a culturally distinct one, whose presence would persist in the legal traditions and inheritance patterns of those regions for centuries. The arrival was a complex blend of peaceful settlement and brutal violence. In some areas, Anglo-Saxon migrants seem to have integrated relatively gradually, taking land that had been depopulated or abandoned, intermarrying with local Britons, establishing villages alongside existing communities. In other areas, the arrival was anything but peaceful. Around 477, a Saxon warlord named Eal landed on the southern coast and inflicted a terrible slaughter on the native Britons, clearing the way for what would become the Kingdom of Sussex. The violence was systematic, deliberate, and aimed at removing the existing population from the land Eala wanted for his own people. The linguistic record bears witness to what happened in regions like this. In Sussex, in Essex, across vast stretches of what would become the Anglo-Saxon heartland, Celtic place names are virtually non-existent. Hills, rivers, settlements, every feature of the landscape that the Britons had named in their own language was renamed by the incoming Germanic settlers. The Celtic words simply vanish from the map. This is not what gradual coexistence looks like. This is what cultural erasure looks like. And yet, the genetic record from this same period tells a more nuanced story. Modern DNA studies of skeletal remains from Anglo-Saxon era cemeteries, combined with analysis of present-day populations, reveal that significant Briton ancestry persists across the entire region. The Britons did not all die. They did not all flee. Many remained, but their descendants would speak the language of their conquerors, worship the gods of their conquerors, and eventually identify themselves as part of the conqueror's world. The fusion happened at the level of bloodlines, while the displacement happened at the level of culture. The society that emerged in the wake of this transformation was unlike anything Britain had seen before. The world depicted in the Epic of Beowulf gives us a window into what Anglo-Saxon culture looked like in its earliest centuries on British soil. It was a society built on honor and battlefield prowess, where a man's worth was measured by what he could boast of in his lord's hall. They were not Christian. They were not literate. Leadership was determined by whoever proved himself the most successful conqueror, the most generous gift giver, the most ruthless protector of his people. Warrior chiefs led retinues of sworn followers, and the greatest of these chiefs presumed to call themselves kings. Beneath the kings stood the thanes, the warrior elite who had pledged their swords to a lord in exchange for treasure, land, and honor. The thanes formed the new aristocracy of Anglo-Saxon England. Beneath them stood the native Britons who had survived the conquest, often reduced to servitude or outright slavery to support the warrior lifestyle of their new rulers. The settlement followed the rivers. Anglo-Saxon migrants came across the sea in oar-drawn boats and pushed inland along the Thames, the Trent, the Humber, establishing new villages at the points where the rivers met fertile land. From these initial coastal and riverine footholds, they spread inland over generations. By the early 6th century, the transformation was well underway. By the 7th century, it would be nearly complete. But the Britons did not surrender their island without a fight. Popular accounts often describe the Anglo-Saxon takeover as if the Britons simply melted away before the incoming tide, as if the indigenous population accepted their fate and faded into the background of history. The archaeological record tells a more disturbing story. The Britons fought back. They fought back for generations. They lost in the end, but the resistance was real, sustained, and at least once, spectacularly successful. The Celtic kingdoms of pre-Roman Britain were long gone by the 5th century, but the Romano-British aristocracy that had inherited their territories had not entirely lost the ability to organize military force. They could not match the disciplined legions that Rome had once commanded, but they could raise armies, hold defensive positions, and occasionally strike back against the Anglo-Saxon advance with devastating effect. The most famous of these counterattacks came at the Battle of Badon, fought somewhere in the southwest of England, probably in Dorset, around the year 500. There, an army of Anglo-Saxons that had been pushing westward met a coalition of British forces under the leadership of a Romano-British captain named Aurelius Ambrosius. Ambrosius was a member of the old Romano-British elite, a man who carried the cultural memory of a vanished empire and the military traditions that had once made that empire unstoppable. At Badon, his forces inflicted a crushing defeat on the Anglo-Saxons. The advance was halted. The momentum was broken. For nearly half a century afterward, the westward expansion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms slowed dramatically, giving the Britons in the west a precious window to consolidate their remaining territories. And here is where one of the most enduring legend in Western culture begins to take shape. Later historians, writing centuries after Badon, conflated, related, or replaced Aurelius Ambrosius with another figure, a figure who would become the most famous king in British history, a figure named Arthur. The stories of King Arthur as we know them today are mostly a medieval invention. The fantastical elements, Merlin the wizard, the lady in the lake, the sword pulled from the stone, the quest for the Holy Grail, are inheritances from Celtic mythology and medieval romance, layered onto a much older and much vaguer historical memory. Even the more grounded aspects of the Arthurian legend, the castle of Camelot, the Round Table, the Battle of Camlan, where Arthur supposedly fell, are believed to be entirely legendary. At best, they might preserve some dim echo of real events that have since been twisted beyond recognition by centuries of storytelling. If Arthur existed at all, he was probably a Romano-British captain serving under Aurelius Ambrosius, or a minor king ruling a kingdom in Cornwall or somewhere in Wales. His name appears in early Welsh poetry and in scattered references in later chronicles, but no contemporary source from the actual period of his supposed life mentions him by name. The historical Arthur, if there ever was one, was almost certainly not a great king ruling a unified Britain from a magnificent castle. He was more likely a regional warlord whose brief and ultimately doomed resistance against the Anglo-Saxon advance enshrined his memory in the cultural imagination of the conquered Britons. And this is the deeper truth about the Arthur legend. Arthur represents not just one man, but the collective grief of an entire people watching their world dismantled. The Britons, who survived the Anglo-Saxon conquest, pushed into the western mountains of Wales, into the southwestern peninsula of Cornwall, across the sea into Brittany in modern France, told stories of a great king who had once held the line. They told these stories for centuries. They told them because the alternative was admitting that nothing and no one had been able to stop what happened to them. Arthur became the hero, who briefly did. Arthur became the proof that resistance had been possible, that defeat had not been inevitable, that somewhere in the past there had been a moment when the tide could have been turned. Whether Arthur was Aurelius Ambrosius wearing a different name, or a Cornish warlord, or a Welsh king, or simply a composite of every British leader who ever fought back, the legend served a function more important than historical accuracy. It preserved the memory of a people who refused to vanish from their own story. But the resistance, however heroic, could not stop what was coming. By the 7th century, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms dominated the eastern and central regions of what had once been Roman Britannia. The Britons had been pushed to the margins. The transformation was nearly complete. And the New England that emerged in the wake of that transformation was about to become something its founders could never have predicted. By the 7th century, the political map of England had crystallized into a constellation of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, known to later historians as the Heptarchy. The 7 primary kingdoms were East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Mercia, Northumbria, Sussex, and Wessex, with smaller kingdoms blinking in and out of existence around their borders, swallowed by larger neighbors or carved out of conquered territory. The boundaries shifted constantly, alliances formed and shattered. Kings rose, conquered their rivals, claimed overlordship of vast territories, and then died, leaving their kingdoms vulnerable to whichever neighbor was strongest at the moment. The political landscape was volatile, violent, and creative in equal measure. To understand the wealth and sophistication of these Anglo-Saxon kings, you only need to look at one extraordinary archaeological discovery. In 1939, on a quiet estate in Suffolk, archaeologists uncovered the burial site of an Anglo-Saxon king beneath a series of earthen mounds. The site was Sutton Hoo, and what they found there rewrote the popular understanding of who these so-called barbarian rulers actually were. The burial contained a 90-foot ship, dragged inland from the coast and buried in a trench. Inside the ship lay an assortment of treasures that defied every assumption about Anglo-Saxon culture. There was an ornate iron helmet decorated with intricate metalwork, almost certainly a ceremonial piece for a king. There were weapons of exquisite craftsmanship, jewelry inlaid with garnets imported from as far away as India and Sri Lanka, silver plates from the Byzantine Empire, gold coins from Frankish Gaul, drinking horns, musical instruments, and ornaments of breathtaking artistry. The burial is believed to be the resting place of King Redwald of East Anglia, who died around the year 624. The presence of dozens of other human remains at the broader Sutton Hoo site, believed to be the king's thanes buried near their lord, demonstrates the depth of the warrior bond in Anglo-Saxon society, a relationship so binding it continued even into death. But the goods themselves tell a different story than the popular image of the Anglo-Saxons as battle-hungry warriors. They reveal kings with international trade connections stretching across Europe and into the Mediterranean. They reveal patrons of art, music, and craft. They reveal a sophisticated material culture that had absorbed influences from across the known world. The Anglo-Saxons had become rich, refined, and connected. What they had not yet become was Christian. That was about to change. In the 590s, Pope Gregory the Great in Rome dispatched a missionary named Augustine to England with a clear mandate: convert the pagan kings of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the Christian faith. Augustine arrived at the Kentish capital of Canterbury in 597, where he was received by the local king. The conversion came quickly, helped enormously by the fact that the king's bride was already a Christian from Frankish Gaul. Within a year of Augustine's arrival, the kings of East Anglia, Essex, and Northumberland had also accepted baptism. The early conversions were unstable. When a Christian king died, his pagan successor often abandoned the new faith, returning to the old gods and the old ways. The cycle of conversion and reversion played out across multiple kingdoms over decades. But Christianity proved persistent, and by the middle of the 7th century, much of the southern Anglo-Saxon elite had been firmly Christianized. A second strand of Christianity arrived from a different direction. Celtic Christianity, which had survived in the western and northern fringes of the British Isles throughout the post-Roman period, began pushing back into Anglo-Saxon territory. King Oswald of Northumbria invited a monk named Aidan to establish a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne off the northeastern coast. The Celtic Christian tradition, with its emphasis on monasticism and scholarship, would produce some of the greatest cultural achievements of early English history, including the Venerable Bede, whose ecclesiastical history of the English nation became the foundation of all later English historical writing. The two strands of Christianity, Roman and Celtic, differed on important points, most notably the date of Easter. The dispute came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 664, where King Oswy of Northumbria sided with the Roman tradition, unifying the English Church under a single calendar. By the second half of the 7th century, England was a Christian nation. The Pope dispatched Theodore of Tarsus to organize the English Church, and over nearly 2 decades, he established the diocese structure, appointed bishops, and created the first institution since Rome to unify all of England under a single organization. Christianity gave the kings something pagan religion never had. It gave them divine legitimacy, moral authority, and a justification for the social order they were building. The age of warlords was ending. The age of nations was beginning. By the early 8th century, the volatile patchwork of the Heptarchy had consolidated through a relentless cycle of warfare, marriage alliances, and inheritance disputes into 3 dominant kingdoms. Northumbria controlled the north, stretching from the Scottish borders down into the heart of England. Mercia held the center and the west, dominating the Midlands and pressing against the Welsh frontier. Wessex commanded the south, its territory anchored on the fertile lands of the Thames Valley and the southwestern peninsula. The smaller kingdoms still existed, but they had been reduced to satellites, paying tribute and accepting overlordship from whichever of the 3 giants was strongest at the moment. This was an age of growing royal authority. The Christian belief that the king was God's representative on earth gave Anglo-Saxon rulers a legitimacy their pagan ancestors had never possessed. They were no longer mere warlords commanding personal followers. They were settled rulers who passed laws, minted coins, signed treaties with foreign monarchs, and claimed authority that extended beyond the reach of their personal sword. Northumbria's golden age came under Oswald and Oswy in the 7th century. They were the first English kings to claim the title Bretwalda, ruler of Britain, and for a time their power stretched from Scotland in the north to the borders of Mercia in the south. But Northumbria's reach exceeded its grasp. The Scots and the Mercians were both formidable foes, and constant warfare on 2 fronts drained the kingdom's resources and manpower. By the 8th century, Northumbria's dominance was fading. Initiative shifted to Mercia. under its greatest king, Offa, who reigned from 757 to 796, Mercia achieved a position of dominance unprecedented in Anglo-Saxon history. Offa subjugated Kent, East Anglia, and Sussex, reducing their kings to vassals or removing them entirely. He was recognized in his own day as Rex Anglorum, King of the English, a title that appeared in his correspondence with European rulers, including the great Frankish Emperor Charlemagne. Oafefa was the first Anglo-Saxon king since the Roman period to mint coins in Britain, and his coinage circulated across the Channel into continental Europe. His most enduring monument is Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork defensive barrier running for 170 miles along the Welsh border, much of which still stands today and continues to define the boundary between England and Wales. With Offa's death, Mercian power began to fray. The kingdom that took its place was Wessex. In 825, King Egbert of Wessex defeated the Mercians at the Battle of Ellendam, breaking Mercian dominance and opening the way for Wessex to claim the title of Bretwalda. The political center of gravity shifted permanently to the south. But the rise of Wessex was about to be tested by a threat that none of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had ever faced before. On the morning of June 8, 793, the monks at the famous monastery of Lindisfarne, the Sacred Heart of Northumbrian Christianity, woke to see ships on the horizon. From those ships came towering Danish warriors armed with iron axes who slaughtered the monks, burned the monastery, and made off with its treasures. A chronicler of the time wrote that no such terror had ever appeared in Britain as the one that came that day from a pagan race. The Vikings had arrived. The Vikings burst onto the European scene in the late 8th century with a suddenness that caught every kingdom from Russia to Ireland completely unprepared. Masters of shipbuilding and seamanship, they could strike anywhere along the coast or up navigable rivers, raiding monasteries, sacking towns, and disappearing back to sea before any organized response could be mounted. Like the Anglo-Saxons before them, what began as raiding evolved into something far more permanent. In 866, a massive Viking force that English sources called the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. It was led by three of the most fearsome warlords of the Viking Age, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubba, and it was unlike any threat the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had faced before. This was not a raiding party. This was an army of conquest. Within months, the Great Heathen Army had captured York and subjugated Northumbria. They moved south into Mercia, breaking the Mercian kingdom and reducing its remaining territory to a Viking puppet state. In 869, they killed King Edmund of East Anglia in battle, and his entire kingdom was absorbed into Viking control. By 871, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained free. Wessex stood alone, the last refuge of independent Anglo-Saxon rule on an island that had been almost entirely conquered. And on the throne of that final kingdom sat a young man, fresh to power, fighting battle after battle in a war that seemed impossible to win. His name was Alfred. Somewhere in East Anglia today, a farmer turns soil his ancestors first plowed 15 centuries ago, speaking a language carried across the North Sea in oar-drawn boats, carrying DNA from warriors, monks, and kings whose names echo through the foundations of his country. The Anglo-Saxons did not conquer England in the way the Romans did. They did not vanish in the way the Romans did either. They did something stranger. They arrived as foreigners and became the foundation. The kingdoms fell. The kings died. The Heptarchy is a memory studied in textbooks, the great earthworks of Offa's Dyke weathered by 1,000 winters. But the language survived. The laws survived. The villages, the shires, the bloodlines, the names on the map, all of it persisted. The Anglo-Saxons were never who we thought. They weren't conquerors. They weren't replacements. They were the beginning of something new. The kingdoms ended. The English never did.